A tiny hand tugged at the edge of Barrett Caldwell's vest, the most powerful man in the city. He looked down. A 7-year-old girl stood there, clutching a crayon sketchbook, her round eyes staring up at him without a trace of fear. Yesterday I saw Mr. Hale doing something to your car." Before Barrett could process her words, the girl's mother, Tessa, a waitress on the night shift, stepped forward, her face drained of color. "Mr. Caldwell, I think you need to hear this." Barrett looked at the mother and child. Then he did something no one in his empire had ever seen him do. He lowered one knee to the floor and brought his eyes level with the little girl. "What did you see? Tell me." The girl opened her sketchbook. A crayon drawing appeared. A black car, a figure crouching behind it, both hands gripping a rectangular plate. Above it, in wobbly child's handwriting, M.R. Hale changed the boss's license plate. Barrett stared at the drawing. His expression didn't change, but Tessa, a woman who survived by reading people, noticed his fingers tightening around the edge of the sketchbook. "Keep the girl in the kitchen. Stay away from the parking lot." Barrett stood up and walked to the parking lot alone. His black car sat in its usual spot. He circled to the rear and looked down at the license plate. Barrett stood still for 3 seconds. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed the only number that mattered. "Frank, get to the restaurant now. Someone switched my plates." He hung up, looked at the fake plate one more time. 12 years. Donovan Hale had stood beside him for 12 years. His right hand. The man he trusted more than his own blood. And this morning, a 7-year-old girl with a box of crayons had told him what his entire empire, hundreds of people, never dared to say. Today's story will show you this. The most dangerous enemy is not the one standing across from you. It's the one who has been standing right behind you for 12 years. If this story touched you, hit the like button and share it with someone you care about. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story, because every story carries a lesson worth hearing. Barrett walked back into the restaurant through the rear door and moved down the kitchen hallway without looking at anyone. The head chef lifted his head, about to greet him, but when he saw the owner's face, he fell silent and turned back to the pot of broth. Barrett went upstairs, entered the second-floor office, and closed the door behind him. He didn't sit down. He stood beside the window, looked down at the parking lot one more time, then took out his phone and called another number. Wade answered after 2 rings. "Come to my office, right now." 4 minutes later, Wade pushed the door open and stepped inside. Wade was half a head taller than Barrett, broad-shouldered, with a face that rarely showed much expression. He'd been with Barrett since the early years, back when the Empire didn't even have a name yet. Wade wasn't a man of many words. Barrett didn't need a man of many words. He needed a man who got things done. Barrett spoke curtly. "Find me everything about the license plate on my car in the lot. Fake plate. Who registered it? Who owns it? Where the original car is. 24 hours. Wade didn't ask why. Didn't ask who had switched it. Didn't ask what Barrett wanted done to that person. He nodded once, then turned and walked out. The door closed softly, without a sound. That was how Barrett's system worked. Orders went down. Results came up. No one asked unnecessary questions. Barrett sat down in the chair behind his desk. In front of him was the stack of inventory ledgers he was supposed to have come here to review that morning. But now the numbers on the paper had become meaningless. He picked up the internal phone and called down to the kitchen. "Tell Miss Morrow to come up to my office." 3 minutes later, Tessa knocked on the door. She stepped inside, both hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach, her back slightly bowed. Tessa wasn't used to standing in this room. In 2 years, working at the Meridian, she had never set foot on the second floor, except when clearing tables. The room smelled of oak and leather, things that belonged to a world different from hers. Barrett pointed to the chair across from him. Tessa sat on the edge of it, as if ready to stand up at any moment. "Aside from what the little girl saw," Barrett said, "do you know anything else?" Tessa swallowed. Then she told him. 2 nights earlier, she had been clearing tables on the second floor close to midnight. It was the late shift. The restaurant had already closed, and only a few cleaning staff remained. When she passed VIP room 3, she heard a voice inside. The door was half closed, Mr. Hale's voice. He was talking on the phone. Tessa hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but she heard one sentence clearly, because Donovan spoke louder than usual, the way a man does when he's trying to emphasize something to the person on the other end. "This Friday. He'll be driving home alone after 11 o'clock. No bodyguard." Tessa stopped and looked at Barrett. He said nothing. His face stayed normal, as though he were listening to a revenue report. But Tessa noticed that his right hand had left the tabletop and dropped to his thigh, where she couldn't see it. She guessed that hand was clenched tight. "I don't know who he was talking to," Tessa continued. "I also don't know who he was talking about. But after my daughter told me about the license plate this morning, I connected the two things. And I thought you needed to know." Barrett looked at her. His eyes didn't soften, nor did they sharpen. They only read, reading whether the woman sitting in front of him was telling the truth or playing some kind of game. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked. Tessa looked down at her hands. "Because I wasn't sure. When I heard it, I thought maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe Mr. Hale was talking about ordinary business, and I'm only someone who carries plates in your restaurant. If I'm wrong, I lose my job. My daughter needs me to have a job." Barrett nodded slowly. Not because he felt pity. He nodded because he understood that logic. In his world, every decision had a price. Tessa had weighed the cost of opening her mouth, and she had still chosen to speak. That carried more weight than any oath of loyalty he'd ever heard. "You were right to tell me," Barrett said. Tessa let out a quiet breath, as though something that had been pressing on her chest for the past 2 days had finally lifted. Barrett stood, walked to the window, and turned his back to Tessa. "From today on, don't bring the little girl to the restaurant anymore. Leave her with someone you trust. You'll keep working as usual. Same shifts, same hours. Nothing changes. And you don't tell anyone about this." "Yes," Tessa said, "including Mr. Hale. Especially Mr. Hale." "I understand." Barrett looked through the window. The parking lot below was empty. The black car sat there in the morning sunlight, still and silent, looking no different from any other Sunday morning. But Barrett knew that from this moment on, everything he saw inside the restaurant, inside his home, inside his whole life, would have to be looked at all over again. Because if Donovan Hale could switch the license plate on his car right in front of hundreds of employees and no one said a word, then how many other things had already been replaced without him knowing? Tessa stood up and walked to the door. Before stepping through the doorway, she turned back to look at Barrett. He was still standing with his back to her, both hands clasped behind him, staring down at the parking lot. She didn't say anything more. She knew she had done her part. The rest belonged to his world. Frank Weber arrived at the Meridian 43 minutes after the call. He drove an old gray car, parked in the far corner of the lot, then went in through the rear kitchen door like a delivery man. Frank never came into the restaurant through the front entrance. It was the habit of a man who had advised Barrett long enough to know that anyone seeing him walk in was information, and information in this world was never free. Barrett waited for Frank in the second-floor hallway. No handshake, no greeting. He only said, "Follow me," then led Frank down to the parking lot. The two men stood behind the black car. Barrett said nothing. He only looked at the license plate, then looked at Frank. Frank bent down and examined it. He took out his phone and snapped 3 pictures from 3 different angles, then photographed the plate frame, the screws, and the small scratch in the paint where the old plate had been removed. Then he stood up, slipped the phone into his jacket pocket, and said, "Let's go upstairs and talk." In the second-floor office, Frank sat across from Barrett. He opened his notebook, wrote a few lines, then looked up. "Switching a license plate has only one purpose," Frank said, "to keep the car from being identified on the road. Traffic cameras, gas station cameras, parking lot cameras, all of them scan plates automatically. If your car is carrying a fake plate, it becomes a car that doesn't exist in the system. Wherever it goes, no one knows." Barrett listened but didn't interrupt. Frank continued, "Combine that with what the waitress told you. Mr. Hale said someone would be driving home alone after 11 o'clock Friday night, with no bodyguard. If that person is you, and the car has a fake plate, then someone is planning for you to leave the restaurant in your own car without a single camera recording it. Where the car turns, where it stops, no one can trace it. And I disappear," Barrett said. His voice was flat, without a ripple. "Correct," Frank replied. "You disappear. And if the plan is careful enough, it could take days, even weeks, before someone truly begins looking. Enough time to erase the trail." Barrett looked at Frank. "You think Donovan is doing this alone?" Frank set down his pen. "One person can switch a license plate, but planning for someone to disappear takes more than one person. It takes a driver, a location, cash so no one can trace the money trail, and it takes exact knowledge of your schedule, what time you leave, what time you come back, who's with you, who isn't. Not many people know those things. Barrett didn't answer right away. He sat still, his finger tapping lightly on the desktop, a steady rhythm like the sound of a clock. Then he said, "I don't know who Donovan is doing this with yet, but I will." Frank nodded. "I suggest checking 2 things right away. First, your life insurance. Who the beneficiary is, whether there have been any recent changes, how much the coverage is. Second, Donovan's personal finances. Money in, money out. Whether there have been any unusually large withdrawals in the past few months. If someone is planning for you to disappear, money usually flows toward the person carrying it out." "Do it," Barrett said. Frank closed his notebook and stood. Before leaving, he stopped at the door. "Barrett, if what I'm thinking is right, this isn't business. This is personal. And personal matters are usually more dangerous because people act on emotion, not logic." Barrett looked at Frank. "I know." Frank looked back at him for a second, as if he wanted to say something more. But then he only nodded and walked out. His footsteps faded down the hallway. The rear kitchen door closed softly. Barrett sat alone in the office. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the window, stretching the shadow of the chair across from him, the chair Frank had just occupied, the chair where Donovan had sat every week to report on business for the past 12 years. Barrett looked at that empty chair and wondered how many times Donovan had sat in that exact place, looking at him, smiling at him, while inside Donovan's head, he was thinking about something else entirely. Sunday night, Barrett waited until the last employee had left the Meridian. He sat in the second-floor office, listening as the footsteps downstairs on the first floor grew thinner and farther apart, as the kitchen door closed, as the front lock turned twice, as the night security guard's motorbike started, then went quiet when he parked in the corner of the lot. Barrett looked at the clock. 11:42. He stood, went down the back stairs, through the pitch-dark kitchen hallway, and reached the security room at the end of the first floor. The room was small, windowless, with 4 monitors mounted on the wall, their pale blue light reflecting against the ceiling. Barrett closed the door, pulled out a chair, sat down, and began rewinding time. He opened the parking lot camera footage from Saturday morning. He fast-forwarded through empty frames, the deserted lot, the morning light slowly brightening, the tree shadows moving lazily across the asphalt. Then he stopped. 9:47 in the morning. The restaurant's rear door opened. A man stepped out. The walk was familiar. Shoulders slightly hunched, footsteps quick but not rushed. The walk of a man who wanted to look normal. Donovan Hale. He glanced once around the parking lot, quickly, then went straight to Barrett's black car. Donovan bent down at the rear of the car, both hands working at the license plate, unscrewing the bolts, removing the old plate, attaching the new one. 3 minutes. Donovan's face was clear on the camera, at a 45-degree angle, enough to identify him without zooming in. When he finished, Donovan stood, tucked the old plate inside his jacket, dusted off his hands, and walked back through the rear door. Barrett saved that piece of footage onto an external hard drive. Then he switched to another section, the second-floor hallway camera. He wanted to review the nights from the past week, especially the nights when Donovan had stayed late at the restaurant. Tuesday night. Barrett skipped to 10 o'clock. The screen jumped. The footage from 10 o'clock to midnight was gone. It wasn't a technical error. The timeline jumped cleanly and neatly from 9:59 to 12:01, the kind of cut made by someone who knew how to use the system. Barrett kept searching. Thursday night, the same gap. 2 missing hours, from 10 o'clock to midnight. Barrett leaned back in the chair. In this restaurant, only 2 people had access to the camera system and the authority to delete footage. Barrett Caldwell and Donovan Hale. Barrett hadn't deleted it, so that left only one person. But Barrett had something Donovan didn't know about. From the first day the camera system was installed at the Meridian, Barrett had placed a separate backup hard drive inside the safe in the second-floor office. That hard drive automatically copied all footage every night at 3 o'clock in the morning, before anyone could delete anything. That was Barrett's habit. He never let one person hold an entire system in their hands. Never. Not even the person he trusted most. Barrett went back up to the office, opened the safe, took out the backup hard drive, brought it down to the security room, and plugged it into the reader. He opened Tuesday night's footage and skipped to 10 o'clock. This time, there was no gap. 10:23 at night. The second-floor hallway. The hallway lights were a dull yellow. A woman stepped out from the rear staircase. Barrett recognized the walk before he saw her face clearly. The way she placed her feet, the way her shoulders tilted slightly when she turned the corner, the way her left hand always brushed lightly along the wall when she moved through a narrow hallway. Barrett had watched that walk every day for 7 years. Monica, his wife, walked down the hallway, not looking at the camera, not looking around, moving straight toward VIP room 3 and opening the door before stepping inside. There was no camera inside the VIP room, by Barrett's own order from the beginning. The door closed. Barrett fast-forwarded. 1 hour, an hour and a half. The door to VIP room 3 stayed shut. He watched the time code running in the corner of the screen, minute by minute, and every passing minute felt like something being drawn out of his chest. 11:58. The door to VIP room 3 opened. Donovan came out first and looked down the hallway. Then Monica stepped out after him. And in the next 3 seconds, the hallway camera recorded something Barrett would never forget. Monica leaned her head against Donovan's shoulder. Donovan reached over and took her hand. They stood that way for 2 seconds. Then Donovan let go, and the two of them turned in opposite directions down the hallway. Monica walked toward the rear staircase. Donovan walked toward the office, as if they had never stood beside each other at all. Barrett rewound those 3 seconds. Watched them again. Monica leaning her head on Donovan's shoulder. Donovan holding her hand, letting go, walking away. Watched it again. Head leaning, hand held. Let go, walk away. Barrett didn't slam his fist on the desk, didn't stand up, didn't shout. He sat there in the dark security room, blue light from the monitors spilling across his face, and he did nothing at all. Not because he wasn't angry, but because this anger was too large to burst out in any ordinary way. It didn't explode. It froze. It became something colder, heavier, and far more dangerous. When Barrett rose from the chair, he turned off the monitors, pulled out the backup hard drive, slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket, and stepped out of the security room. He walked down the dark kitchen hallway, up the stairs, and back to the second-floor office. If anyone had seen him then, they wouldn't have seen a man who had just discovered his wife's betrayal. They would have seen Barrett Caldwell as usual, walking evenly, face unchanged, eyes straight ahead, and that normalness was the most frightening thing of all, because those who knew Barrett understood that when he shouted, he was angry. But when he was silent and calm, he was making a decision, and Barrett Caldwell's decisions had never been something anyone wanted to be on the receiving end of. Monday morning, Barrett arrived at the Meridian earlier than usual. He hadn't slept the night before, not because of anger. Barrett had moved past anger from the moment he sat in the security room the previous night. What kept him awake was a single question circling in his mind all night long. How many more things were there that he still didn't know? Barrett entered the office, closed the door, and called Wade. Wade arrived within 10 minutes. Barrett stood beside the window, his back turned to Wade, and said only one sentence. "Bring Donovan to my place outside town. I want to speak to him privately." Wade didn't nod right away. That was rare. Usually, Barrett's orders went down, and Wade carried them out without needing to think. But this time, Wade stood still for half a second, as if weighing something, then finally nodded. He turned, walked toward the door, and nearly ran into Frank Weber standing in the doorway. Frank looked at Wade. Then he looked back at Barrett. He didn't need to hear a single word to understand what was happening. Barrett's face, Wade's posture, the air in the room, all of it spoke more clearly than any sentence could. "Wade, wait in the hallway," Frank said. Wade looked at Barrett. Barrett neither nodded nor shook his head. Wade stepped back outside and closed the door. Frank walked in, placed the file case on the desk, then looked straight at Barrett. "Call it off." Barrett turned around. His eyes were cold. "You don't know what happened." "I know enough," Frank said, his voice not giving an inch. "I know you just ordered Wade to take someone away. I know what that place outside town is used for. And I know that if you do this, you're no different from Donovan." Barrett frowned. Frank continued. "He wanted to take you away. Now you want to take him away. Tell me, where's the difference?" Barrett clenched his right hand. His knuckles went white. He stood there, staring at Frank, and for those few seconds, the room was so quiet they could hear the ceiling fan turning above them. Frank didn't back down. He was the only man in the world who could stand in front of Barrett Caldwell without lowering his head, not because Frank wasn't afraid, but because Frank knew that if he was afraid too, then there would be no one left to tell Barrett the truth. "If you handle it this way," Frank said, lowering his voice, "the police won't come for Donovan. They'll come for you." And Donovan wins. Barrett looked down at his clenched hand. Then he opened it, one finger at a time. "Call it off," he said. His voice was dry, clipped, like a man who had just swallowed something very bitter, but knew he had to swallow it. Frank nodded and said nothing more about it. He knew when to stop. He pulled out a chair, sat down, opened the file case, and pushed the documents toward Barrett. "The investigation results," Frank said. "Your life insurance. $25 million. The beneficiary is Monica Caldwell. 4 months ago, the coverage was increased to 3 times the original amount. Your signature is on the adjustment paperwork." Barrett frowned. "I didn't sign any paperwork increasing my insurance." "You sign hundreds of documents every month," Frank said. "Contracts, authorizations, confirmations, permits. Who arranges those documents, marks where you need to sign, then takes them to be filed?" Barrett didn't need to answer. They both knew. Donovan. Frank turned to the next page. "There's more. I had Wade check the slush fund. There's a shortfall. Donovan withdrew it 2 weeks ago. The amount isn't large compared to the total fund, but it's enough to hire someone for dirty work without leaving a bank trail. The timing of the withdrawal matches the time the waitress described seeing a strange driver appear in the parking lot." Barrett sat down in the chair. Slowly, like a man who had just realized the house he had spent more than 10 years building had a crack running from the foundation to the roof, a crack he had somehow never seen. "He used my money," Barrett said, his voice very soft, "to hire someone to hurt me." Frank said nothing. He let Barrett absorb it on his own. After a while, Barrett asked, "If the police get involved, they'll look into the slush fund. They'll start asking where the money came from." Frank looked straight at him. "Yes, that's the risk." "I'm not saying there's no risk." Barrett looked out the window. The parking lot below. The black car was still parked there with the fake plate he hadn't changed back yet. He thought about the years he had spent building the empire, the sleepless nights, the decisions ordinary people wouldn't even dare imagine. Then he thought about the security room the night before, about the 3 seconds of footage where Monica leaned her head against Donovan's shoulder, and he thought about the fake license plate, about the plan to make him disappear, about the $25 million in insurance that someone would receive after he no longer existed. "If I handle Donovan my way," Barrett said slowly, each word deliberate, "I'm no different from him. I've lived that way long enough." Frank looked at Barrett. In all his many years as an advisor, this was the first time he had ever heard Barrett say something like that. Frank didn't know whether it was a turning point or only a passing moment, but he nodded, closed the file, and said, "Then let me handle the police side. You just need to keep everything normal until I say it's enough." Barrett nodded. Frank stood, went to the door, and called Wade in. Wade stepped inside and looked at Barrett. Barrett said, "Cancel the order from earlier. No one is going anywhere." Wade nodded, then vanished behind the door as if he had never been there at all. On Monday evening, Barrett Caldwell came home at exactly 7 o'clock. He parked the car in the garage, shut off the engine, and sat behind the wheel for 1 more minute. The house in front of him was large, quiet, the living room lights glowing warmly behind the white curtains. 7 years ago, this was the place he had thought would be his final stop after everything. Now he looked at the house the way a man looks at a door when he's no longer sure what is waiting for him inside. Barrett stepped in. The smell of food drifted from the kitchen into the air. Monica stood beside the dining table, rearranging the vase of flowers in the center. She looked up when she heard the door, and her face changed. Not much, but enough for Barrett to catch the surprise in her eyes before she managed to hide it behind a smile. "You're home early," Monica said. "Yeah," Barrett replied, taking off his coat and hanging it on the hook beside the door. "I thought we should have dinner together tonight." Monica looked at him for another second, trying to read something on Barrett's face, but his face gave her nothing to read. Barrett pulled out a chair and sat down. Monica brought out the food, 2 plates, 2 glasses of wine, candles on the table. The table was beautiful, always beautiful. Monica was the kind of woman who knew how to arrange everything until it looked perfect, from the vase placed in exactly the right spot to the napkins folded in exactly the right style. Barrett had once loved that about her. Now he looked at that perfection and wondered how long it had only been a coat of paint over the surface. They ate in silence for several minutes. Barrett cut a piece of meat, chewed slowly, then set down his knife and fork. "I've been thinking about the assets," he said, his voice ordinary. as if they were discussing repairs to the roof. "I want to move most of it into a charitable trust, in case something happens to me." Monica was lifting her wineglass to her mouth. She set it down a little faster than usual, but not fast enough to be obvious. "What do you mean something happens?" she asked. "My work carries a lot of risk. You know that," Barrett said, his eyes on his plate. "I want to make sure that if one day I'm gone, everything is used in the right place, that it doesn't fall into the hands of people who shouldn't have it." Monica placed her hand on the table. Her fingers closed around the stem of the wineglass, tighter than usual. Barrett saw it. He saw everything now. "But you already have insurance," Monica said, her voice trying to stay gentle. "There's already a will. The lawyer has taken care of everything. Why change it all of a sudden?" "It's not all of a sudden," Barrett replied. "I've been thinking about this for a long time. Moving the assets into a charitable trust instead of leaving them to an individual. Cleaner. More meaningful." Monica looked at him. Her eyes tried to stay normal, but Barrett could read something behind them, a flicker that wasn't worry for her husband, but worry for herself. Barrett knew the difference between those two things. He had sat across from hundreds of people in his life, and he knew how to tell who was worried about him and who was worried about their own pocket. "What do you think?" Barrett asked. Monica took a slow sip of wine, then smiled. "You always think farther ahead than everyone else. But this is big. We need time to discuss it more carefully. You shouldn't decide in a hurry." "Yeah," Barrett said. "No hurry." They kept eating in silence. The candles burned between them, the small flames trembling gently, casting the shadows of the two of them onto the wall. Anyone looking through the window at that moment would have seen an elegant married couple having dinner in a beautiful house. No one would have known that one person was acting, and the other didn't know she was also being watched. Monica cleared the plates and said softly, "I'm going upstairs first. I'm a little tired." She kissed Barrett lightly on the forehead as she passed him, the same as every night, the same as she had for 7 years. Barrett remained seated at the dining table, listening to her footsteps going up the stairs, listening to the bedroom door close. Then he looked toward the kitchen counter. Monica's phone was lying there. She had forgotten it when she brought the plates to the table. Or she thought she would come back down to get it. Or she hadn't thought anything at all, because she didn't know that from now on, everything she left behind would be seen. Barrett stood, walked to the kitchen counter, and picked up the phone. He unlocked it. Monica hadn't set a new password. She was still using the old one Barrett had known since the first year. He opened the call history. The most recent call. Donovan Hale. 14 minutes after dinner. Duration. 9 minutes. Barrett looked at the words on the screen. 14 minutes. She had gone upstairs, closed the door, and 14 minutes later, she had called Donovan. 9 minutes. Enough time to say, "He's asking about the assets. He wants to move them into a charitable trust. Our plan may have a problem." 9 minutes to break everything 7 years had built. Barrett placed the phone back on the kitchen counter, in the exact same spot, at the exact same angle, screen facing down, just as it had been when Monica left it there. He didn't wipe off his fingerprints. There was no need. Monica wouldn't check. Barrett walked out onto the balcony. The city spread wide below him. Yellow streetlights, cars small as toys moving along roads he knew by heart. The night wind blew softly, carrying the scent of wet grass from the back garden. He stood there, both hands gripping the railing, and remembered the first night they moved into this house. Monica had stood in the empty living room, turned in a circle, and said, "I don't need a big house. I only need you home more." Barrett had nodded, had promised, and then he hadn't kept that promise. He left the balcony, stepped back inside, locked the glass door, and turned off the living room lights. He went up the stairs. Past the bedroom, Monica had already turned off the lights and was lying with her back to the door, the blanket pulled up to her shoulders. Barrett didn't know whether she was asleep or lying there staring into the darkness, waiting for him to pass. He didn't need to know, because he already knew enough. He knew that the woman lying in that bedroom, the woman he had married 7 years earlier, had called the man who was plotting to hurt him only 14 minutes after kissing his forehead goodnight. Tuesday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Donovan Hale knocked on Barrett's office door at the Meridian. 2 short, even knocks, just like always. That was the way Donovan had knocked for many years. 2 sounds that were enough, not too soft to seem timid, not too hard to seem like an equal. Barrett knew that knock before Donovan ever opened his mouth. "Come in," Barrett said. Donovan stepped inside, wearing a gray suit, his hair neatly combed, his stride relaxed. He pulled out the chair across from Barrett and sat down, leaning back, crossing one leg over the other, with the posture of a man who considered this room his own home. Barrett watched the way Donovan sat and realized he'd never paid attention to it before. Donovan sat in Barrett's office without the slightest air of a subordinate. He sat like a man waiting for his turn to inherit. "Barrett," Donovan began, his voice low and slow, the kind of voice he used when he wanted to sound concerned. "You've changed a lot lately. Canceling meetings with outside partners, staying at the restaurant later than usual, not going anywhere. The men in the restaurant have noticed too. I'm worried about you." Barrett looked at Donovan, looked at the eyes trying to read him, looked at the mouth speaking words of concern, looked at the hand resting comfortably on his thigh. That hand had removed the license plate from Barrett's car on Saturday morning. That hand had held his wife's hand in the second-floor hallway at midnight. That hand had signed the order to withdraw money from Barrett's fund to hire someone to harm him. And that hand was now resting on his thigh, loose and calm, as if there were nothing in the world worth worrying about. Barrett didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the liquor cabinet beside the window, and took out the single-barrel whiskey he only drank on important occasions. He poured it into 2 glasses, slowly, steadily. He placed one glass in front of Donovan, kept the other in his hand. Then he sat back down in his chair, lifted the glass to eye level, and watched the afternoon light pass through the amber liquor. "Donovan," Barrett said, his voice light, "you know I trusted you more than anyone. You came in when there was nothing. You stayed when things were at their hardest. I haven't forgotten that." Donovan picked up the whiskey glass. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why I'm asking, because I'm worried." Barrett took a small sip, set the glass down. Then he spoke again, slower this time, each word falling into the quiet room. "You also know how I deal with people who betray me." Donovan's face didn't change, but his fingers tightened around the whiskey glass, so slightly it was almost impossible to see. "Almost," Barrett continued, still in that same voice, that same rhythm, as though he were telling an old story. "Do you know what makes me different from other men in this world?" Donovan shook his head. "I never strike when I'm angry," Barrett said. "An angry man rushes. A man who rushes makes mistakes. I don't rush. I wait. I watch. I gather one piece at a time, one day at a time. And when I know enough," Barrett lifted his glass and took another sip, "I act only once." He set the glass down and looked straight into Donovan's eyes. "But I'm sure you already know that, because you've been beside me longer than anyone." Donovan smiled. A broad, familiar smile, the kind of smile he used at every party, every meeting, every handshake with a partner. "Of course I know," Donovan said. "That's why I'd never want to stand on the other side of you." Barrett smiled. A small smile, just enough to pull at one corner of his mouth. "Good," he said, "because the other side isn't a place anyone wants to stand." Donovan set the whiskey glass on the desk, stood, and adjusted the collar of his suit. He stepped forward to shake Barrett's hand, the same way he always did at the end of a conversation. Donovan's hand was dry, his grip firm, with exactly the right amount of pressure. "Take care of yourself," Donovan said. "Call me if you need anything." Barrett held Donovan's hand half a second longer than usual. Only half a second, but he felt it. Donovan's hand was warm while he held it, but when he let go, Donovan's fingers curled back faster than usual, as though he wanted to pull his hand away as quickly as he could. Barrett took note of that. Donovan walked out and closed the door. His footsteps sounded in the hallway, then stopped. He stood outside Barrett's office door with one hand braced against the wall. No one saw him then. No one saw him standing there for several seconds, eyes lowered to the floor, taking one long breath before he walked on. And no one saw his right hand, the hand that had just shaken Barrett's, trembling faintly as he shoved it into his trouser pocket. Inside the office, Barrett poured more whiskey into his own glass. Donovan's glass was still more than half full. Donovan had taken one sip at the beginning, then hadn't touched it again. Barrett looked at that glass. An ordinary man would have thought Donovan didn't like whiskey, but Barrett knew Donovan drank whiskey every week, and he knew Donovan only stopped drinking when he needed a clear head to handle a situation. Donovan hadn't drunk tonight because Donovan needed to think, needed to analyze the conversation that had just happened, needed to determine whether Barrett knew or didn't know. Barrett lifted his own glass, and drank slowly. The whiskey was bitter and warm on his tongue. He looked at the empty chair across from him, the chair Donovan had just sat in, then looked at the whiskey Donovan had left behind. 2 chairs, 2 glasses of whiskey, one full, one emptied, like 2 men who had just sat there, one knowing everything, the other trying to guess. Barrett finished his whiskey, set the glass down, and took out his phone. A message from Wade. The information on the fake license plate had come in. The original car belonged to a vehicle whose registration had been abandoned 3 months earlier. No owner, no trace. Clean, professional. Exactly the way Donovan did everything. Barrett locked the phone and put it back in his pocket. He picked up Donovan's glass, poured the remaining whiskey into the sink beside the liquor cabinet, then placed both glasses upside down on the tray. Done. As if the conversation had never happened. But Barrett knew it had happened, and he knew that from the moment Donovan stepped out through that door with a trembling hand in his trouser pocket, the game had officially begun. Donovan would start rushing, and a man who rushed made mistakes. Barrett had told Donovan that. He simply hadn't told him he was talking about Donovan himself. 2 weeks after the whiskey conversation, Tessa Morrow was still working the night shift at the Meridian as usual. She still carried plates, still cleared tables, still smiled politely at guests, still remained the waitress no one paid attention to. But the small notebook in her apron pocket now recorded different things. Not orders from table 6 or table 12, but short lines, written quickly during the moments when she stood in the corner of the kitchen waiting for food to come out. Tuesday, 10:20 at night, Donovan entered VIP room 3, left at 11:50. Wednesday, rear parking lot, strange car with white plate, parked from 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock. Driver didn't enter the restaurant. Friday, Monica arrived at the rear door at 10:15, went up to the 2nd floor. Donovan had been up there since 9 o'clock, a few lines every night, each line a small truth. Tessa wasn't reckless. She didn't spy, didn't follow anyone, didn't try to open the VIP room door. She only did what she had been best at since she was little. Observed, remembered, and wrote it down. 2 weeks later, Tessa brought the notebook up to Barrett's office. She placed it on the desk between them. Barrett opened it and turned each page. Small handwritten lines, neat, compact, steady, exact dates and times. Names, locations, time in, time out, no guesses, no emotion, only facts written in blue ink on ruled paper. Barrett turned to the last page, then closed the notebook. He looked at Tessa. "You did this while still waiting tables every night?" Tessa nodded. "I'm used to observing. When you've lived alone for a long time, you have to see everything before it gets too close." Barrett looked at the notebook one more time. "This notebook is worth more than every report my finance team has ever written." He put the notebook into his desk drawer and locked it. Said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. But that same day, as Tessa walked down the 1st floor hallway after the afternoon shift, she felt someone watching her. She turned back. Donovan was standing at the end of the hallway, having just come out from the stairs. He said nothing, didn't nod in greeting, just stood there looking at her. It wasn't the look of a manager watching an employee pass by. It was the look of a man weighing, measuring, asking himself, "Is this woman dangerous? What does this woman know?" Tessa turned around, kept walking, and felt that stare on her back until she turned into the kitchen. 2 days later, Donovan called Tessa into the manager's office. The room was smaller than Barrett's office, but Donovan had long since turned it into his own territory. Bookshelves, leather chair, curtains pulled tight. He sat behind the desk, both hands laced together, and waited until Tessa closed the door before speaking. "Sit down, Miss Morrow." Tessa didn't sit. She stood 2 steps from the desk, her hands at her sides, her back straight. Donovan didn't force her. He leaned back in his chair and began speaking, his voice light, ordinary, as if they were discussing next week's schedule. "I know what you're trying to do. I don't know who you're doing it for, or who you think you're helping, but I know enough." He paused, letting the sentence sink in, then continued. "I know where you rent your room. I know which bus route you take to work. And I know that if you lose your job here, all I need is a single phone call, and no restaurant in this city will ever hire you again. One call, Miss Morrow. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Tessa stood there, her hands clenched tight at her sides. She felt her heart pounding inside her chest, felt her legs tremble slightly, felt the survival instinct inside her screaming at her to lower her head. apologize, and leave the room. But she didn't do that. She looked straight at Donovan and remembered her daughter's crayon drawing, remembered Barrett's face when he knelt down to Jolene's eye level, remembered the feeling when she had decided to open her mouth that morning instead of staying silent the way she had stayed silent once before in her life, and paid for it with 2 lives. "Who do you think will believe a waitress?" Donovan said, leaning forward, over Barrett Caldwell's longest-serving manager. Tessa was silent for 3 seconds. Then she spoke, her voice small but steady. "Maybe you're right. Maybe no one will believe me. But do you know who will believe me? Mr. Caldwell. Because he's already checked the license plate, and he's already watched the cameras. Do you think he doesn't know yet?" Tessa wasn't sure exactly which camera footage Barrett had seen. She was gambling, but she saw what she needed to see. Donovan's face changed. Not much. 1 second. His jaw hardened, his eyes narrowed, and his laced hands tightened on the desk before he could regain control. 1 second. Enough for Tessa to know she had hit the mark. "You should be careful," Donovan said. His voice was still light, but that lightness was thinner now, more brittle, like a sheet of ice over deep water. Then he stood, adjusted the collar of his suit, walked past Tessa, and left the room. He didn't look back. Tessa remained standing alone in the manager's office. Her hands were shaking. Her legs were shaking, but she was still standing. She stood there until she heard Donovan's footsteps fade completely down the hallway. Then she finally breathed out, stepped out of the room, and went straight down to the kitchen. She washed her face with cold water at the staff sink, dried it, then took out her phone and called Barrett. Barrett answered after 1 ring. Tessa told him about the conversation with Donovan. Every detail, every sentence, every word. When she finished, the other end of the line stayed silent for several seconds. Then Barrett's voice came through, and Tessa recognized that his voice was different. Not hot anger, cold anger. The kind of voice she imagined would make anyone who had known Barrett for years want to leave the room. "From now on, you don't return to the restaurant. You and the little girl move into the apartment I'll arrange. Tonight." Tessa hesitated. "I don't want to owe you anything." "You don't owe me," Barrett said. "I owe you, because you're the only person in that building who dared to tell me the truth." Tessa hung up. She stood in the restaurant kitchen, looking around at the place that for the past 2 years had been her life, the source of income that fed her daughter, the place where she knew every door sound, every hallway corner, every coworker's face by heart, and she knew that tonight was the last night she would stand there. She took off her apron, folded it neatly, placed it on the kitchen counter, then walked out the rear door for the last time. The next morning, Barrett called Donovan into his office at the Meridian, not with urgency, not with coldness. Barrett sent the message through the internal phone, his voice normal. "Donovan, come up to my office for a minute when you're free." The kind of message Barrett used every week, the kind of message that gave no one a reason to worry. Donovan came up within 5 minutes. He knocked twice, stepped inside, and pulled out the chair to sit in the same old place. But Barrett noticed something different from the last time. Donovan didn't lean back. He sat straighter, his shoulders slightly tense, like a man trying to appear relaxed while his body refused to cooperate. Barrett didn't look directly at Donovan. He was looking over a stack of papers on the desk, with the air of a busy man, briefly handling a small matter, before returning to his real work. "I heard there's been a little trouble," Barrett said, his eyes still on the papers, related to an employee. Donovan asked, "What happened?" Barrett looked up, folded the papers to one side, as if only now truly beginning the conversation. "Miss Morrow, the waitress on the night shift. Someone said she was threatened with losing her job, threatened that no one in the city would ever hire her again. Not a very pleasant kind of threat." Donovan's face didn't change. He kept the same polite, concerned expression he had polished over many years. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "Did she report it to management?" "Not yet," Barrett replied. "And maybe she won't, because she's afraid. People who get threatened are usually afraid, especially people who have nothing to protect themselves with, except their work." Barrett said it gently, without emphasis, without slowing down, without staring deeply into Donovan's eyes. He said it as if they were talking about replacing a light bulb in the kitchen. And that very gentleness was what made it heavy. Because Donovan had known Barrett long enough to understand that when Barrett truly wanted to say something important, he never shouted. He lowered his voice, and Donovan was hearing a very soft voice. "I don't know who threatened her," Barrett continued, his tone normal, even carrying a faint smile. "And I don't need to know right now. But I want you to understand one thing, Donovan. Anyone who touches an employee in my restaurant, I consider that the same as touching me. She carries plates for my guests to eat from. She clears tables in the restaurant I built. She wears an apron with my name on it. She's one of my people. And you know what happens when someone touches one of my people." Barrett looked at Donovan, still smiling, still gentle, still normal. That smile was the smile everyone who worked with Barrett knew, and everyone feared. Because that smile never meant Barrett was happy. It meant Barrett was giving someone one last chance to correct their own mistake before he corrected it for them. Donovan nodded. "Of course," he said. "I'll check and see who caused the problem. It could be a customer, or maybe an internal staff conflict." "Yeah," Barrett said. "Check it, and if you find whoever is behind this, let me know. I want to meet that person." Donovan stood, adjusted the sleeve of his suit, nodded once more, then walked out. He closed the door with exactly the right amount of force, walked with exactly the right rhythm, no faster and no slower than usual. But Barrett had placed something inside Donovan's head that was more dangerous than any direct threat. He had placed uncertainty there. Donovan walked out of the office, not knowing whether Barrett had been speaking in general or speaking straight to his face, not knowing whether Barrett knew or didn't know, not knowing whether the conversation had been accidental or intentional, and that not knowing would eat away at Donovan from the inside, hour by hour, day by day, because the thing a man with a hidden secret fears most is not knowing whether that secret has already been exposed. That fear would make Donovan begin to rush, check more, make more contact, move more, and every rushed action was a trace. Barrett didn't need to chase Donovan. He only needed to sit still and wait for Donovan to run into the net on his own. Barrett remained behind the desk and picked up the stack of papers. He didn't read it. The papers were only a prop. He looked out the window, down at the parking lot where the black car was still parked, the fake plate already replaced with the real one since yesterday. Neat and clean, with no one knowing it had ever been switched. Exactly like everything inside the Meridian now. Normal on the outside, completely different underneath. 3 days after moving into the apartment Barrett had arranged, Tessa Morrow began to collapse. Not in a sudden way, slowly, little by little, like a candle burning down to the bottom with no one adding more wax. The apartment was small, clean, on the 5th floor of a quiet apartment building on the east side of the city. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a balcony overlooking a small street lined with maple trees. It was nicer than anywhere Tessa had ever lived, but that beauty couldn't feed her. Tessa no longer had a job. No paycheck at the end of the month. No nightly tips to drop into the glass jar on the kitchen shelf. The money she had been saving to buy Jolene new shoes. The savings she had were enough for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if she cut back. And Tessa knew how to cut back. She had been doing it her entire life. In the morning, she made cereal for Jolene, filled the bowl with milk, and sat beside her daughter watching her eat. Jolene asked, "Aren't you eating, Mom?" Tessa smiled. "I already ate while you were still asleep." She hadn't eaten. At lunch, she made Jolene a sandwich and cut off the hard crusts, because Jolene didn't like crusts. Tessa ate the crusts. Some days, she ate nothing at all, only drank water, and told herself she would eat dinner. When evening came, she looked at the food in the refrigerator and calculated in her head, if she ate dinner tonight, then by next Saturday, Jolene would be short 1 meal. She closed the refrigerator. On the first day, she felt a little tired. On the second day, she felt dizzy when she stood up too quickly. On the third day, she was washing dishes and had to grip the edge of the sink because the kitchen spun once in front of her eyes. Tessa knew her body was trying to tell her something, but she didn't listen. She didn't have time to listen. She had a daughter who was 7 years old and needed to eat 3 meals a day, needed milk, needed fruit, needed shoes that still fit. Tessa's body could wait. Jolene couldn't. On the third night, around 11 o'clock, Jolene was already asleep in the small bedroom, the blanket pulled up to her chin, her drawing notebook resting on the pillow beside her head. Tessa sat on the living room sofa, trying to look through job listings on her phone. The screen slowly blurred. She blinked, trying to focus, but the words on the screen kept drifting right, and then left. Her hands were cold. Not cold the way the air is cold. Cold from the inside. The kind of cold that spread from her chest to her fingertips. The kind of cold that told her the body was giving up. Tessa put the phone down. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. The room spun, the ceiling tilted. She sat back down on the sofa, drew a long breath, and thought about who to call. She had no family in this city, no friends close enough to call at 11 o'clock at night. Former coworkers at the Meridian were people she couldn't contact anymore. She scrolled through the contacts in her phone, watching the names slide past, and realized a truth she had known for a long time, but had never had to face as clearly as she did in that moment. She had no one. Her finger stopped on one name, Barrett Caldwell, the phone number he had given her the night she moved into this apartment. If something happens, call this number. Anytime. Tessa had thought she would never use that number. She didn't want to owe anyone more, didn't want to trouble anyone more. But now, sitting on the sofa with cold hands and blurred eyes, she realized that pride wouldn't feed her daughter if Jolene woke up tomorrow morning and her mother couldn't get up. She pressed call. The phone rang twice. Barrett answered. His voice was alert, sharp, not the voice of a man who had just been woken. Mr. Caldwell, Tessa said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. I think I need help. I don't. Her voice broke apart. The room spun harder. Tessa felt the phone slip from her hand, heard it fall onto the wooden floor, and then everything became very far away, very light, and very dark. Barrett heard the fall. Then silence. He called back. 1 ring, 2 rings, 5 rings. No one answered. Barrett took his car keys, left the house, and drove across the city near midnight. 20 minutes. He knew the address because he was the one who had arranged the apartment. He parked in front of the building, went up to the 5th floor, and stopped in front of the apartment door. The door wasn't locked. Tessa hadn't managed to lock it when she moved from the sofa to the phone. Barrett opened the door. The living room was dark, with only the streetlight spilling in through the thin curtains. Tessa was lying on the sofa, one hand hanging down to the floor, her phone lying a few centimeters from her fingertips. Her face was white, her lips dry, her breathing light and shallow. Barrett placed 2 fingers against her wrist. Her pulse was weak, but still there. He took out his phone and called his private doctor. Come to the address I'm sending you right now. A woman, 27 years old, unconscious, weak pulse, fast. The doctor arrived within 30 minutes. A middle-aged man carrying a medical bag, asking few questions. He checked her blood pressure, heart rate, blood sugar. He gave her fluids through an IV and an injection. The doctor looked at Barrett and said, exhaustion. Her blood pressure dropped very low. Severe malnutrition. She probably hasn't had a proper meal all week. Her body has been warning her for a long time, but she didn't stop, or she couldn't stop. Barrett stood beside the living room door, arms crossed over his chest, watching the doctor work. He didn't ask why she hadn't eaten. He knew why. Because there wasn't enough money. Because the child needed to eat first. Because that was how a mother alone calculated when everything was running out. She had given her own portion to Jolene and told herself she would be fine, until she wasn't fine anymore. Tessa gradually stabilized. Color returned to her face. Her breathing deepened. Her pulse became steadier. The doctor gave a few instructions, then left. Barrett closed the apartment door and locked it. He looked into the small bedroom. Jolene lay curled on the bed, the blanket pulled up to her chin, her drawing notebook beside the pillow, sleeping deeply, knowing nothing, hearing nothing. To the little girl, tonight was only an ordinary night. Barrett closed Jolene's bedroom door gently. He returned to the living room and looked at Tessa lying on the sofa, the IV line attached to her wrist, her face pale beneath the streetlight. Then he sat down on the floor, his back against the wall across from the sofa, and waited. Barrett Caldwell, the man an entire city feared and respected, sat on the cold wooden floor of a small apartment at 1 o'clock in the morning, waiting for a waitress to wake up, and he didn't go anywhere. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, scattering a pale gold stripe across the wooden floor of the living room. Jolene woke in the small bedroom, stayed in bed for a little while holding her drawing notebook, then climbed down, opened the bedroom door, and ran out. Her mother was lying on the sofa, covered with a blanket, eyes closed, breathing evenly. Jolene looked at her mother for 1 second, then turned toward the kitchen table, and the little girl stopped. There was a man sitting at the kitchen table in her home, Mr. Barrett. He was sitting in the small wooden chair where her mother usually sat every morning, his back against the wall, one hand holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. His suit jacket was wrinkled, the collar of his shirt slightly sagging, dark circles under his eyes. He didn't look like the restaurant owner Jolene had seen at the Meridian, the man who walked with his back straight and made everyone lower their heads when he passed. He looked like someone who had been sitting there for a very long time and hadn't slept. Jolene wasn't afraid. She had met Barrett twice, once at the restaurant when she tugged on his sleeve and pointed to the drawing, and once when her mother brought her to the new apartment and said, "Mr. Barrett helped us have a new place to live." To Jolene, Mr. Barrett was her mother's restaurant boss, the man who wore nice suits and didn't talk much. The little girl stood in the bedroom doorway, tilted her head as she looked at him, then asked, "Mr. Barrett, why are you here?" Barrett looked down. He had been sitting there since 1 o'clock in the morning, his back against the wall, eyes open, listening to Tessa breathing on the sofa, listening to the IV drip fall in steady drops, listening as the city slowly went quiet and then slowly grew noisy again when morning came. He had sat there for hours, doing nothing, calling no one, not checking his phone, just sitting and waiting. And now a 7-year-old girl was standing in front of him, hair messy, eyes still heavy with sleep, asking him a question he didn't know how to answer properly. Barrett Caldwell, the man the whole city treated with caution, sat there awkwardly because he didn't know what to say to a little girl. In a conference room, he could silence 10 men with one sentence. In the restaurant, he gave an order, and everything ran like clockwork. But here, in this small kitchen, in front of a little girl wearing cat-printed pajamas, he had no script. "Your mom was a little tired last night," Barrett said, choosing each word carefully, as if he were negotiating the most important contract of his life. "Your mom needs to rest a little more. She'll wake up soon." Jolene looked toward the sofa, then back at Barrett. Then she nodded, accepting that answer easily in the way only children can, without suspicion, without asking more, believing because an adult had said it. She walked to the kitchen table, climbed onto the chair across from Barrett, placed her drawing notebook on the table, and said, "I'm hungry." Barrett looked at the child, then looked around the kitchen. He stood, opened the refrigerator. Inside, it was almost empty. A carton of fresh milk with a little more than half left, a box of cereal, a few eggs, a bag of bread, a little bit of vegetables. Tessa had saved almost all the food for Jolene. Barrett looked at the nearly empty refrigerator and understood. He understood why Tessa had fainted the night before, not because she was weak, but because she had chosen to let her child eat first and let herself eat later, and later had stretched on until her body refused to keep going. Barrett took out the milk, took the cereal box, and found a bowl in the upper cabinet. He poured milk into the bowl, his hand tilting a little too far, the milk nearly spilling over. He poured in the cereal, and several pieces fell outside the bowl, rolling across the tabletop. Barrett picked them up and put them back into the bowl. The movement was clumsy, slow, unlike anything he had ever done. Barrett Caldwell had built an entire empire on absolute precision, but pouring milk for a child's breakfast required effort from him. He placed the bowl of cereal in front of Jolene. Jolene looked at the bowl, looked at Barrett, then picked up the spoon and began eating. She ate and talked at the same time, the way 7-year-old children talk, jumping from one subject to another with no need for connecting logic. "Mr. Barrett, I can draw a cat now," Jolene said, her mouth still full of cereal. "Mom said it looks like a mouse, but I said it's a cat, because I drew it. I know what I drew." Barrett listened. He sat across from the child, both hands around his cold coffee cup, and listened. Not the polite kind of listening he used at parties, the kind where he nodded at the right rhythm and forgot everything the moment the other person turned away. He truly listened about the cat that looked like a mouse, listened about the teacher at the new school, whom Jolene said was a little strict but gives candy on Fridays, listened about the picture she was still drawing of a house with round windows, because round windows are prettier than square windows. Barrett listened to all of it, and he realized something. It had been a very long time since anyone had talked to him without needing something from him. Every conversation in his life had a purpose. Asking for money, asking for power, asking for protection, asking for a favor, asking for a chance. Every smile had a price. Every sentence carried a calculation. But this little girl sat here telling him about a cat because she wanted to tell him. That was all. She needed nothing from him except for him to sit there and listen. Jolene had nearly finished the bowl of cereal. She set down the spoon, looked at Barrett, then reached out and lightly tugged on the sleeve of his wrinkled suit jacket, just like the first time at the restaurant. Her tiny hand held the edge of the fabric, gently, naturally, as if that was the only way she knew how to get an adult's attention. "Mr. Barrett, are you sad?" Barrett looked down at that hand, that tiny hand on the edge of his rumpled, dusty suit jacket after a sleepless night. He looked at that hand and tried to remember the last time anyone had held his hand. People shook his hand for business. People patted his shoulder because they wanted closeness. People touched him because they were afraid, or because they needed something. But holding his hand, truly holding it, the kind of holding that needed no reason, the kind of holding that happened only because someone wanted to hold on, he couldn't remember the last time. Maybe it had been his mother. Maybe it had been a very long time ago. "No," Barrett said, his voice softer than he wanted. "I'm not sad." Jolene looked at him for another second, as if deciding whether to believe him. Then, she let go of his sleeve, picked up the spoon, ate the last spoonful of cereal, and began telling him more about the picture of the house with round windows. No one knew exactly when Tessa woke up. She stood at the living room doorway, one hand braced against the frame, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes still blurred. She looked into the kitchen. She saw Barrett Caldwell, the powerful boss, the man the entire city treated with caution, sitting at the small kitchen table in a cheap apartment, his suit wrinkled, his eyes dark, listening to her daughter talk about a cat that looked like a mouse. In front of Jolene was the bowl of cereal he had poured the milk into himself, clumsily, spilling it outside the bowl, with a few pieces of cereal still scattered across the tabletop because he hadn't managed to pick them all up. Tessa looked at that scene, and tears began to fall. Not because she was sad, not because she was in pain, but because it had been so long, so very long, since anyone had sat at the dining table in her home. It had been so long since she had woken up and found someone there. And he wasn't there because he needed anything from her. He was there because she needed someone to be there. That was all. That evening, Jolene went to sleep early. She lay in the small bedroom, the blanket pulled up to her chin, her drawing notebook open beside her pillow to the picture of the house with round windows. Tessa had eaten a bowl of porridge Barrett had someone bring over at noon, the first proper bowl of food she had eaten in nearly a week. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were brighter, her hands were warmer, and she could move around the apartment without needing to hold onto the wall. Barrett stayed the entire day. He didn't explain why he stayed, and Tessa didn't ask. Some things didn't need explaining when both people already understood. Around 8 o'clock that night, after Tessa tucked the blanket around Jolene and closed the bedroom door, she walked out onto the balcony. Barrett was already there. He stood leaning against the railing, both hands gripping the metal bar, looking down at the street below. The city was beginning to light up. The cars on the road were growing fewer. A distant horn sounded somewhere, and faint music from a bar at the end of the block drifted upward, then dissolved into the wind. Tessa pulled out a plastic chair, sat down, and held a cup of warm water in her hands. Barrett didn't turn around, but he knew she was there. They sat in silence for a long while, the kind of silence between two people who didn't need to fill every empty space with words. Then Tessa spoke, her voice light, not looking at Barrett but at the row of streetlights below. "How did you build all of this?" Barrett didn't answer right away. He left the railing, pulled out the other plastic chair, and sat down beside Tessa. Two cheap plastic chairs on the balcony of a small fifth-floor apartment, where the most powerful boss in the city sat beside a waitress who had fainted from not having enough food. Barrett looked out at the city. And when he spoke, his voice was different. Not the voice of Barrett Caldwell that everyone knew, not the voice that gave orders, negotiated deals, and made an entire room fall silent. It was the voice of a 16-year-old boy, still living somewhere inside the 32-year-old man. A boy who had never truly grown past the day he was about to describe. "My mother worked 2 shifts every day," Barrett said. The morning shift at the laundromat down the street. The evening shift at a small restaurant near the bus station. She left for work at 6 o'clock in the morning and came home at 11 o'clock at night, 7 days a week. She never took a sick day in her life. Not because she didn't get sick. Because she didn't have the right to be sick. Missing one day meant losing one day's pay. Losing one day's pay meant her son would miss a meal. She didn't allow that to happen. Barrett stopped. Not because he had lost his place. Because the next part was heavier. When I was 16, he said, his voice slower now. My mother was working the morning shift at the laundromat when she collapsed, right in the middle of her shift. She didn't have time to say anything. Her heart. She lay on the laundromat floor, among other people's clothes, and she didn't make it before the ambulance arrived. Tessa said nothing. She sat still, the warm cup of water in her hands, and listened. The laundromat owner called me, Barrett continued. He said, "Come pick up your mother's things. I need someone to cover her shift tomorrow." My mother had just been lying on his floor, and he was worried he wouldn't have someone to iron clothes. Barrett looked down at his hands, the hands that had built an entire empire, signed thousands of documents, taken hold of a kind of power the 16-year-old boy from back then wouldn't have dared dream about, but those hands hadn't been able to save his mother. That day, I decided I'd never let anyone step over me again, he said. I built everything. Money, power, restaurants, a system. I built walls so high no one could touch me. No one could call me and say, "Come pick up the things. I need someone to cover the shift tomorrow." I built all of it so I'd never have to kneel down and pick up things off someone else's floor again. He stopped. Then he spoke more softly. But I forgot one thing. What? Tessa asked. When you build walls high enough that no one can get in, Barrett said, then no one inside wants to stay either. The wind moved across the balcony, gently stirring Tessa's hair. The city below was still lit, still moving, still alive. The two of them sat quietly. Then Tessa spoke. Her voice was small, not because she wanted to speak softly, but because the story she was about to tell lived in a place very deep inside her, a place she never opened for anyone. And when she did open it, her voice naturally grew quiet out of fear that speaking too loudly would wake all the pain inside. My parents died when I was 19, Tessa said. A car accident on the way to my graduation. It was raining hard that night. The road from my parents' house to the school was more than 100 kilometers. All mountain road. I knew that road was dangerous in the rain. I knew. She stopped, drew a breath. But I didn't call to tell them not to come, because I wanted to see their faces when I received my diploma. I wanted to walk onto the stage and look down at the audience seats and see my parents sitting there. I wanted that more than anything in the world, so I didn't call, and they got in the car, and they never made it. Tessa looked into the cup of water in her hands. The surface trembled slightly because her hands were shaking, but her voice didn't shake. Her voice was flat, even, the voice of someone who had lived with this pain for so long that it had become part of her breathing. Since then, Tessa said, I've never stayed silent when I knew something that could save someone. Never again, no matter what it costs. Barrett said nothing. He didn't say, I understand. He didn't say, it wasn't your fault. He didn't say any of the comforting things people usually say when they hear a sad story, because he knew those words didn't help. He knew because he had heard them too. After his mother collapsed on the laundromat floor, people had said all kinds of things to him. She lived a good life. She would be proud of you. Time will heal. None of it helped. None of it touched the place that truly hurt, because the place that truly hurt didn't need words. It needed someone sitting beside you who understood. That was all. The two of them sat on the balcony of the small fifth-floor apartment in the middle of the large city, and neither of them said anything more. The wind blew. The streetlights flickered. The music from the bar below ended, then rose again with another song. Barrett looked out at the city where he had spent more than 10 years building power. Tessa looked out at the street she had walked home along every night after her shift for the past 2 years. They were looking at the same city, but from 2 different lives. One had everything, but no one had stayed. One had nothing, but still dared to speak. And tonight, on this balcony, those 2 people sat beside each other in silence, because they both understood that some kinds of pain didn't need comfort. They only needed someone to sit beside them and not leave. Wednesday. Barrett left Tessa's apartment at 6 o'clock in the morning, before Jolene woke up. He drove home, showered, changed into a fresh suit, and arrived at the Meridian at 7:30. From the outside, he looked no different from any other morning. Back straight, steps steady, face expressionless. But inside that man, something had shifted after the night spent sitting on the floor of the small 5th-floor apartment and the evening on the balcony, listening to the story of a mother collapsing on the laundromat floor and 2 parents who never made it to a graduation ceremony. Barrett didn't know what to call it. but he knew he didn't want to wait anymore. Enough was enough. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Barrett sent 3 short messages to 3 people. The content was exactly the same. Basement. 10 o'clock. Don't tell anyone. The basement of the Meridian was a room very few people knew existed. It sat beneath the main kitchen, its entrance disguised as a freezer door, locked with a code only Barrett knew. Inside was a small meeting room, a long wooden table, 6 chairs, no windows, no cameras. Barrett had built this room in the early days of the Meridian. This was where he made decisions that no wall outside these 4 walls was allowed to hear. 10 o'clock. 3 people walked in. Wade came first, standing beside the door by habit, his back against the wall, arms folded across his chest. The other 2 sat down in their chairs, silent, watching Barrett. No one asked why they were there. When Barrett summoned people down to the basement, no one asked. They came, they listened, they acted. That was how things worked, and that was why they were still sitting in those chairs. Barrett sat at the head of the table. He brought no papers, no phone, nothing except his voice and his eyes. He looked at each person one by one, slowly, long enough for each of them to feel that gaze stopping on their face. Then he spoke, his voice even, light, without emphasis, as if he were reading a menu to a guest. Donovan Hale can't be trusted anymore. 1 sentence, 6 words. The room changed instantly, not because anyone breathed harder or looked at one another, but because the air thickened. Donovan Hale's name carried weight in that basement. He was the man who managed almost everything: accounts, money flow, schedules, contacts, personnel. Donovan held half of Barrett's operating system in his hands, and Barrett had just said 6 words that made half of that system evaporate. Barrett continued, still in the same voice, the same rhythm. From this moment on, Donovan has no access to any accounts. He doesn't enter the basement. He doesn't know my schedule. He doesn't meet with any partner unless a third person is present. All of Donovan's authority is frozen. Every system password is changed within 1 hour after this meeting. Barrett didn't explain why. Didn't tell them about the license plate. Didn't tell them about the camera footage. Didn't tell them about Monica, about the slush fund, about the $25 million insurance policy. In Barrett's world, when the boss said a man could no longer be trusted, that meant the man was finished. The reason was the boss's privilege. No one needed to know, and no one had the right to ask. If Donovan asks why his access has been cut, Barrett said, you answer, Mr. Caldwell is restructuring the system. No further explanation. Don't say more than that 1 sentence. If Donovan asks a second time, you say, you should ask Mr. Caldwell directly. Then walk away. The 3 men nodded. No one opened their mouth. Barrett stood. His chair slid back, scraping lightly against the concrete floor, the only sound in the room. He walked to the door, his hand closing around the iron bar, then stopped. He turned his head and looked at the 3 men sitting at the table, and he added one final sentence. If anyone in this room tells Donovan that today's meeting happened, I'll consider that person to have chosen Donovan's side. He didn't say what would happen if someone chose Donovan's side. There was no need to say it, because all 3 men in the room knew. They knew not because Barrett had ever done anything in front of them. They knew because they had been beside Barrett long enough to understand that he never said a sentence he wasn't prepared to carry out. Every warning from Barrett was a promise, and Barrett Caldwell had never broken a promise. Barrett opened the door, stepped out, and went up the stairs back to the first floor. Behind him, the 3 men remained in the basement for several more seconds, looking at one another in silence, then stood one by one and left. Wade was the last to leave the room. He turned off the lights, closed the door, entered the new lock code Barrett had changed that very morning. Then he went up to the kitchen, took out his phone, and began changing every system password within 45 minutes, faster than the 1 hour Barrett had required, because Wade understood that when Barrett said 1 hour, what he meant was as soon as possible. And when Barrett Caldwell wanted something soon, no one in his empire dared make him wait. Wednesday afternoon, Barrett came to Tessa's apartment. He knocked twice, waited for Tessa to open the door, then stepped inside. Jolene was at the home of someone Tessa trusted, an elderly neighbor on the 3rd floor whom Tessa had known since the day she moved in. The apartment was quiet. Tessa sat at the kitchen table, with a glass of water and a half-eaten plate of fruit in front of her. Her color was much better than it had been 2 days earlier. She stood when Barrett came in, but he waved his hand, telling her to sit back down. Barrett pulled out a chair and sat across from her, no circling around. "I'm going to end this on Friday," he said. "I'll stay at the Meridian alone that night. I'll tell Monica I'm doing end-of-quarter inventory, staying late, and I don't need anyone. No bodyguards, no staff, just me, alone in the second-floor office, door open, lights on." Tessa looked at Barrett. "You're using yourself as bait." "That's right," Barrett said. "Donovan is rushing. I've been forcing him to rush since last week. He lost system access this morning. He'll know something is changing. If he wants to act, he has to act soon. And Friday night is the perfect opportunity he'll think I handed him myself." Barrett explained further. Frank had contacted the police. Unmarked cars would be positioned at 3 corners around the restaurant. Frank would sit in a car in the parking lot across the street, maintaining direct contact with the police. Wade would be inside the restaurant, hidden in the storage room beside the second-floor hallway. Everything was ready. Only one thing was missing. "But I need to know exactly which way they'll come in," Barrett said. "I need to know which door is open, which door is closed, which hallway isn't covered by cameras, which corner is a blind spot. If I position people in the wrong place, they'll get in, and Wade won't be able to stop them in time." Tessa said nothing. She stood, went to get a large blank sheet of paper from Jolene's drawing pad and a pencil. She sat back down, placed the paper on the table, and began to draw. No need to look at a photo. No need for a map. She drew from memory. 2 years of moving through that building every night had carved every step into her mind more clearly than any architectural blueprint. Tessa drew the first-floor layout first. The main kitchen, the secondary kitchen, the freezer, the dry storage room, the staff break room, the hallway leading to the rear door, the rear parking lot. Then she drew the second floor, the main staircase from the lobby, the rear staircase from the kitchen, the hallway leading to the VIP rooms, Barrett's office at the end of the hallway. She marked 2 spots with crosses. "The rear kitchen door," Tessa said, pointing to the first cross. "After 10 o'clock at night, this door isn't locked. The night shift staff often go outside to smoke or take out the trash, so they wedge the door with a piece of wood so they don't have to swipe their cards every time they go in and out. Everyone knows about it except you, because you never go down to the kitchen at 10 o'clock at night." Barrett said nothing. Tessa pointed to the second cross. "The second-floor hallway camera, at the right turn before VIP room 2. Last week, someone cleaning the glass bumped into it, and the camera angle shifted about 15 or 20 degrees. Now it points at the wall instead of the hallway. Someone coming up from the rear staircase, turning right at that spot, won't be caught on camera until they reach the area in front of your office." She drew an arrow from the rear kitchen door, through the rear staircase, up to the second floor, turning right at the section where the camera was misaligned, then straight to Barrett's office. "This is the fastest route, and the least likely to be detected. If someone wants to enter your office without anyone knowing, they'll take this way." Barrett looked at the diagram, looked at the arrow, looked at every detail Tessa had marked. Then he said, "I built this restaurant. I know every brick." Tessa looked straight into Barrett's eyes. "You know the floor plan, but do you know the basement storage door has been jammed since March, and no one has fixed it? Do you know the second-floor camera is crooked? Do you know the staff wedge the kitchen door with a piece of wood every night?" Barrett was silent. "You built the building," Tessa said, "but I've lived inside it every night for 2 years." Barrett looked at her. Not the look of a boss looking at an employee. Not pity. It was the look of a man who had just realized that the person sitting across from him wasn't someone who needed to be protected. She was someone he needed. Barrett folded the diagram carefully, then said, "I'll give this to Wade. We'll position according to the route you drew." Tessa nodded. Then she added, her voice calm but firm, "On Friday night, I want to be in the first-floor kitchen." Barrett looked up. "No, I know every sound in that restaurant," Tessa said. "I can tell the difference between the sound of the kitchen door when an employee opens it because they kick it with their foot to hold it. A stranger opens it lightly and closes it right away. Completely different. I can tell the difference between footsteps on the rear wooden staircase. Staff walk fast and hard. Someone who doesn't want to be heard walks slowly and steps with the front of their feet. You need my ears down there to know exactly when they come in and which way they go." Barrett looked at Tessa. He wanted to say no again. She had just fainted 2 days ago. She didn't belong in this world. The world of nights with traps being set and doors opening in the dark. But he looked into her eyes and saw there what he had seen from the very morning she pulled Jolene forward to point at the crayon drawing. Determination. Not reckless determination. The kind of determination that belongs to someone who has lost enough to understand that silence costs more than speaking. "I've gone too far already," Tessa said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I can't sit in this apartment and wait for the result. I can't anymore." Barrett looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he nodded. Once. Short. Final. He stood, took the diagram Tessa had drawn, folded it, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket. Before stepping out the door, he stopped and spoke without turning around. "Friday, 9 o'clock at night. You enter through the kitchen door before the last employee leaves. Sit in the kitchen. Don't turn on the lights. Don't come out. If anything happens, text Wade. Only text Wade. Don't call me. Don't run up to the second floor. Don't do anything except sit still and listen. Clear?" "Clear," Tessa said. Barrett opened the door and left. Tessa remained seated at the kitchen table, looking at the spot where the paper had just been, where now only a few pencil crumbs were left on the tabletop. She had drawn the restaurant's layout from memory in less than 10 minutes. Every door, every hallway corner, every stair. 2 years of carrying plates, clearing tables, and walking back and forth through that building every night had given her something no one else in Barrett's empire had. Not power, not money, but knowledge of the place where she had lived. And on Friday night, that knowledge would decide everything. Friday, 9 o'clock at night. The Meridian closed earlier than usual. Barrett told the manager he needed to do end-of-quarter inventory and didn't need any staff to stay behind. The last employee left the restaurant at 8:45. Tessa entered through the kitchen door at 8:50, before it was locked. She moved through the familiar darkness of the kitchen, a place where she knew every corner by heart, then sat down on the floor behind the main kitchen counter, her back against the stainless steel cabinet, her phone gripped in her right hand, eyes closed, ears open. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. She knew this kitchen in the dark better than most people knew it under the lights. Upstairs, Barrett's office was lit. The desk lamp cast a warm, golden pool over the wooden desktop, over the glass of whiskey already poured, over the leather chair where Barrett sat. The office door was slightly open. Light slipped into the dark hallway like an invitation. Barrett sat behind the desk, both hands resting on the surface, his back against the chair, his eyes fixed straight on the door. He looked like a man waiting for dinner guests to arrive. Calm. Patient, as if he could sit there all night without moving. Wade was inside the storage room beside the second-floor hallway, 4 steps from Barrett's office door. He stood in the dark, his back against the wall, breathing slowly and evenly, the way a man breathes when he's used to waiting in silence. His phone was set to vibrate, screen face down so no light could leak out. Outside the restaurant, 3 unmarked police cars were parked at 3 different corners. No lights, no sirens, no sign that they were anything other than ordinary cars. Frank sat in his own car in the parking lot across the street. His phone connected directly to the captain of the plainclothes police team. He kept the phone on his lap, the screen glowing, waiting. 10 o'clock. Nothing happened. The restaurant was quiet. Tessa sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the steady hum of the industrial refrigerator, the faint leak of a water pipe near the sink, the wind slipping through the ventilation gap in the ceiling. The sounds were so familiar they were almost invisible. That was exactly why Tessa was here. Because she knew which sounds belonged to the restaurant and which sounds didn't. 10:20. Still silent. 10:35. Tessa tightened her grip on the phone. Her palm was wet with sweat. She wiped her hand on her pants and gripped it again. 10:47. Tessa heard it. The rear kitchen door. The soft turn of the hinge, without a creak because someone had opened it very slowly. Then the sound of the door closing. Light. Clean. With no foot kicking it to hold it open. The Meridian staff always kicked the rear door with their foot to keep it from slamming shut, because the hinge was heavy and the door closed itself with a spring. But whoever had just entered didn't hold the door. They opened it, slipped in, and closed it right away. Fast, quiet, not wanting the sound of the door to linger. Then footsteps. 2 pairs of shoes on the kitchen tile floor. Not the sound of soft-soled kitchen shoes worn by the staff. Hard shoes, higher soles, stepping toe first before lowering the heel. The walk of people trying not to make noise, but not used to moving through a kitchen. They passed the main kitchen counter, less than 3 meters from where Tessa sat. Tessa held her breath. She listened as the footsteps moved past, moved farther away, then turned toward the rear staircase. Footsteps climbed the wooden steps, slow, trying to be light, but the old wood still rasped softly under the weight. Tessa opened her phone and typed a message to Wade, her hand trembling but the words clear. 2 men, rear kitchen door, going up the rear stairs. Wade's phone vibrated in the second-floor storage room. He read the message, slipped the phone into his pocket, and clenched his hand tight. The second floor. Footsteps reached the head of the hallway. Stopped, then continued, turning right at the spot where the camera had shifted, exactly along the route Tessa had drawn on the diagram. In front of Barrett's office door, golden light spilled through the narrow opening. A hand pushed the door. The door opened wide. The room was half dark. The desk lamp shone down on the wooden desktop, on the glass of whiskey, on the 2 hands resting on the desk. Barrett sat there, staring straight at the door, staring straight at the 2 men standing on the threshold, and he said, his voice light and even, as if he were speaking to 2 employees arriving late for a meeting. "You're 7 minutes late. I hate people who are late." The 2 men froze. They had prepared for many situations, but they hadn't prepared for the target sitting there waiting for them and telling them exactly how late they were. For 1 second, no one moved. Then the hallway lights came on. Wade stepped out from the storage room, blocking the way behind them. At the same time, quick footsteps sounded from the main staircase. The plainclothes police had come up and were standing in a line at the head of the hallway. Barrett in front, Wade behind. Police on both sides. No way out. No one shouted. No one ran. Everything happened in 15 seconds, fast and quiet, the same way Barrett ran everything in his life. The 2 men were restrained right there in the hallway, cleanly, without a wasted sound. Barrett stood, stepped out from behind the desk, walked up to one of the men being held on his knees on the hallway floor. Barrett didn't touch him. He only stood very close, bent down a little, and spoke softly enough that only the man in front of him could hear. "I'm asking once. Who sent you?" The man looked up, looked into Barrett's eyes, and whatever he had been told beforehand, whatever loyalty he had promised, all of it dissolved when he looked into those eyes, because those eyes weren't angry. They weren't afraid. They were calm, and that was what made him open his mouth. "Hale," he said. "Donovan Hale." Barrett nodded. Once. Then he straightened, turned away, and walked back toward the office. "Hand them over to the police," he told Wade, his voice normal, as if he were telling an employee to clear the tables at the end of the day. Then he stepped into the office, sat back down in his chair, picked up the glass of whiskey that had been poured since the beginning of the evening, and took a slow sip. Outside in the hallway, the police took the 2 men down the stairs. Barrett sat behind the desk, the glass of whiskey in his hand, and didn't turn to look, as if nothing had just happened. Downstairs, Tessa sat in the dark kitchen. She heard sounds from the second floor drifting down through the ventilation shaft, the quick footsteps, the brief restraint, then silence. She leaned her back against the stainless steel cabinet, closed her eyes, and breathed out. A long, trembling breath, like someone who had been holding her breath underwater for too long and had finally broken the surface. Footsteps on the stairs. Light. Even. Barrett came down to the first floor, crossed through the kitchen, and stopped where Tessa was sitting. He stood there, looking down at her in the darkness, the light from the kitchen window cutting across half his face. "It's done," he said. Tessa opened her eyes and looked up at Barrett. "I know," she said. "I heard." That same night, Barrett left the Meridian after the police took the 2 men away. He didn't go with Frank, didn't go with Wade. He drove alone through the empty late-night streets, the yellow streetlights flickering across the dew-damp pavement. Barrett knew the way to Donovan Hale's apartment without looking at a map. He knew because he was the one who had found that apartment. He was the one who had signed the lease. He was the one who had paid the rent every month for 8 years. When Donovan had nothing, Barrett had said, "You need a decent place to live. I'll take care of it." And he had taken care of it. 8 years. Not 1 month missed. The plainclothes police followed behind Barrett, keeping a 10-minute distance according to the plan Frank had arranged. Barrett parked in front of the building, shut off the engine, and sat behind the wheel for 1 more minute. He looked up at the 6th floor. Donovan's lights were still on. Barrett got out of the car, crossed the lobby, and took the elevator up. 6th floor. Empty hallway. Barrett walked to the door of apartment 602, the door he had stood before many times, on nights when he came for dinner, on nights when they discussed work late, on nights when Donovan opened the door and said, "Come in, I just opened a fresh bottle." Barrett didn't knock. He took the spare key from his jacket pocket, the key Donovan had given him on the first day he moved in, and unlocked the door. The apartment opened before him. The living room lights were on, and Barrett saw Donovan Hale standing in the middle of the room beside the bed, an open suitcase on the mattress, clothes folded hastily inside. Donovan was packing, preparing to run. Donovan heard the door open, turned back, and saw Barrett standing on the threshold. He froze. His hand still held a half-folded dress shirt, one foot caught between steps, his eyes wide. Not fear. Not yet. It was the reaction of a man who had just seen something he knew would come, but hadn't thought would come so soon. Barrett stepped inside, closed the door behind him, lightly, cleanly, as if he were closing the door to his own home. "Where were you planning to go?" Barrett asked, his voice normal, as if asking a colleague at the end of the day. Donovan placed the dress shirt into the suitcase, tried to keep his hands from shaking. "Business trip," he said. "You know that. I have a schedule this week." Barrett looked at Donovan, looked at the suitcase, looked at the pile of clothes folded in a rush, looked at the passport lying on the bedside table, looked at the second phone Donovan never used in front of Barrett, now lying beside the suitcase, its screen still glowing. "No," Barrett said. "I don't know. Because you don't have any business trips anymore." Donovan didn't answer. His arms dropped to his sides as if they had lost their weight. Barrett walked past him to the armchair in the corner of the living room, the chair Barrett had sat in drinking many nights while the two of them discussed business until late, and he sat down, comfortably, legs crossed, back against the leather cushion, as if he were in his own home. And in a way, he was right, because he paid for this apartment. Donovan remained standing in the middle of the room, between the open suitcase and the former boss sitting in the armchair. He looked like a man trying to calculate what to say, what to do, what kind of performance to give. But he wasn't fast enough, because Barrett spoke first. 12 years, Barrett said. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't soft, wasn't hot, wasn't cold, just flat. Flat like water before someone throws a stone into it. "I gave you everything: money, power, a place to stand, this apartment, the car you drive, the suit you wear, the name you have in this world. I gave you all of it because I considered you a brother. Not the kind of thing people say because it sounds good. I mean truly." Donovan opened his mouth, but Barrett raised one hand, lightly, just enough for Donovan to understand that he wasn't allowed to speak yet. "You used my money," Barrett continued, "to hire people to hurt me. You switched my license plate so I could disappear without anyone being able to trace me. You were with my wife inside the restaurant I built, on the second floor I designed, in the VIP room, where I ordered no cameras installed because I believed privacy mattered. And you used that very trust to betray me." Barrett looked at Donovan. "You thought I wouldn't know." Donovan swallowed. Silence stretched for 3 seconds. Then he spoke, his voice trembling slightly but still trying to stay steady. "You don't understand. You never understand." Donovan looked straight at Barrett, and for the first time that night, his eyes didn't dodge. "I built half of this empire. Half. I stayed awake with you in those first nights. I handled the things you didn't want to know about. I negotiated with the people you didn't want to meet. I did all of it. And in the end, everyone only knows one name: Barrett Caldwell. I stood beside you for more than 10 years, and no one ever saw me. I'm tired of living in your shadow, tired of being the man behind while you stand in front, tired of everything I built carrying your name." Barrett listened to all of it, didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He listened because he wanted to hear. He wanted to know what the man he had trusted for 12 years truly thought when the last mask was finally stripped away. And now he knew. Donovan hadn't betrayed him because he hated Barrett. Donovan betrayed him because he wanted to become Barrett. That was the most dangerous thing, because it didn't come from hatred. It came from desire, and desire has no bottom. Barrett rose from the chair. Slowly, he adjusted the sleeve of his suit. Then he looked at Donovan and said, his voice very soft, almost a whisper, "You want to step out of my shadow? Fine. Starting tonight, you'll step out of my shadow. Forever." Barrett walked past Donovan, went to the door, and opened it. The 6th floor hallway was no longer empty. 2 plainclothes police officers stood there, one holding documents, the other waiting. Barrett stepped out through the door, stopped at the threshold, and turned his head to look at Donovan one last time. Donovan stood in the middle of the room beside the half-packed suitcase, his eyes moving from Barrett to the police, then back to Barrett. And in Donovan's eyes at that moment, Barrett saw something he would remember for a very long time. Not fear, not rage, understanding. Donovan understood that everything was over, not that it had just ended tonight. It had ended from the morning. A 7-year-old girl opened a crayon notebook. Barrett said nothing more. He turned, walked down the hallway, entered the elevator, and left. Behind him, the police stepped into the apartment. Donovan Hale was handcuffed inside the apartment Barrett Caldwell had paid rent on for him for 8 years. On the bed lay the open suitcase he would never get to close. On the wall hung a photograph of him and Barrett at the grand opening of the Meridian many years earlier. 2 men smiling, shoulder to shoulder, like brothers. The photograph still hung there, but the story behind it no longer matched the smiles inside the frame. Midnight, Barrett drove home. The road was familiar, the turns he had taken thousands of times, the white fences on both sides of the driveway, the neatly trimmed lawn, the large house standing in the dark with only one patch of light glowing in the first-floor living room window. Monica was awake. She knew. Barrett didn't know how she knew. Maybe Donovan had called before he was arrested. Maybe Monica had realized it herself when Donovan stopped answering his phone. Maybe she had simply seen a message on the second phone she thought Barrett didn't know she had. It no longer mattered. Barrett parked in the garage, turned off the engine, and stepped into the house. Monica was sitting on the living room sofa. No television on, no book in her hand, no glass of wine. She sat there with her back straight, both hands resting on her lap, looking directly at the door. When Barrett walked in, she didn't stand, didn't smile, didn't ask, "Where have you been so late?" the way she always did. Her face was empty. Not empty because there was no emotion, empty because she had taken off every layer of performance, one by one, while sitting there waiting for him to come home. This was the real Monica. No makeup, no social smile, no soft, false voice of concern, just a 29-year-old woman sitting on the sofa in a large house, watching her husband walk in, and knowing that everything was over. Barrett said nothing. He walked to the coffee table in front of Monica and placed 3 things on it. First, a set of photos printed from the camera footage. Photos of Monica and Donovan stepping out of VIP room 3, Monica leaning her head against Donovan's shoulder, Donovan holding her hand. Second, the statement from the driver that Wade had obtained from the police that night. The driver who had confessed the entire plan, who hired him, how much he was paid, where Barrett was supposed to be taken. Third, the financial record from the slush fund, the money Donovan had withdrawn, the withdrawal date, the amount, matching the time the driver was hired. Barrett placed each item on the table, slowly. He didn't throw them, didn't slam them down. He placed them, like laying cards on a poker table. Monica looked down, looked at the camera photos, looked at the statement, looked at the financial record. Her eyes moved over each sheet of paper, each line of text, and Barrett saw the moment she understood there was nothing left to lie about, nowhere left to hide. Everything was on the table, black and white, clear, impossible to erase, impossible to deny. Monica looked up, looked at Barrett, and when she spoke, her voice didn't shake. She didn't cry, didn't beg. Her voice was flat, even, the voice of someone who had prepared for this moment for a long time, maybe from the day she decided to nod along with Donovan's plan. 7 years, Monica said. 7 years, I ate dinner alone in this house. 7 years, I sat at that dining table. She pointed toward the dining room and looked at the empty chair across from me. 7 years, I waited for my husband to come home, and my husband only came home when he needed to change suits or sign papers. You have everything, power, money, the respect of the whole city. Every time you walk into a room, people stand up. Every time you speak, people listen. And me, I only had 4 walls and the sound of the clock on the shelf. Barrett stood beside the table, looking at Monica. He didn't sit down, didn't move closer. He stood there and listened, the way he had listened to Donovan in the apartment half an hour earlier. But this time was different. This time hurt more. Because Donovan was the man he had trusted. But Monica was the woman he loved, or or thought he loved. Barrett wasn't sure anymore. Donovan gave me something you never did, Monica continued. Attention. He listened when I talked. He asked me how my day was. He remembered what flowers I liked, what food I liked, what movies I liked. Did you ever ask me how my day was, Barrett? Once? In 7 years? Barrett didn't answer, because the answer was no. He knew the answer, and he knew Monica knew it too. He had spent 7 years building an empire, and forgotten that this house needed to be built too. He had paid for everything, but he hadn't paid with his presence. And presence was the one thing money couldn't buy. Monica drew a breath. If I divorced you, I would leave with nothing. Everything is in your name. This house, the cars, the accounts, all of it. Lawyers, courts, years dragging on, and in the end I would still be the one walking out that door empty-handed. Donovan said there was another way, a faster way, a way where I wouldn't have to fight in court for years. And that way, Barrett said, his voice very soft, was to erase me from your life. Monica didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She only looked at Barrett, and in her eyes Barrett saw something that hurt him more than the betrayal itself. He saw exhaustion. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepiness, the kind that belongs to someone who has fought loneliness for too long and finally let go. Barrett looked at Monica, looked at the woman he had married 7 years earlier in a small apartment, the woman who had stood beside him when he didn't yet have the Meridian, didn't yet have an empire, didn't yet have anything but ambition and 2 empty hands. And he said, slowly, word by word, "You could have screamed in my face. You could have smashed everything in this house. You could have walked out in the middle of the night and never come back. I would have understood. I would have accepted it, but you didn't do that. You chose to sit across from me at the dinner table and smile every night, kiss my forehead every evening, say goodnight every time I turned off the lights, while waiting for the day I disappeared. That's what I can't forgive. Not the betrayal, the performance." Monica closed her eyes. Tears fell. Not many. 2 thin, silent lines. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall because she was too tired to pretend anything anymore, even to pretend she wasn't crying. A knock came at the door. 2 even, polite knocks. The police. Barrett didn't look toward the door. He looked at Monica. Monica opened her eyes, looked toward the sound of the knock, then looked back at Barrett. She rose from the sofa, slowly. No hurry, no resistance. She stood there for 1 second in the middle of the living room, in the middle of the house where she had lived for 7 years, and she looked smaller than Barrett had ever seen her. Not small because she was afraid, small because everything she had built, kept, performed, and endured now meant nothing anymore. Monica walked toward the door, stopped, turned her head to look at Barrett one last time. "I truly loved you once," she said. "A very long time ago." Barrett looked at her red eyes, her bare face, her loose hair, her thin nightgown, looked at the woman he had once promised to stay beside, and he said, his voice so low it was almost as if he were speaking to himself, "I know. That's the only reason this hurts this much." Monica turned back and opened the door. 2 police officers stood in the hallway. She stepped out, without looking back again. The police walked beside her, gently, leading her down the hallway, through the front door, and out into the late night. Barrett stood at the living room doorway, listening to the sound of footsteps fading, the car door closing, the car driving away. Then silence. The large house became very quiet. Barrett stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the sofa where Monica had just been sitting, looking at the coffee table with the 3 sets of papers still lying there, looking at the dining chair Monica had said she had stared at empty for 7 years. And for the first time, Barrett Caldwell understood what it meant to stand inside his own house and feel that it was no longer home. 2 days later, Barrett came to Tessa's apartment in the afternoon. He didn't call ahead. He simply drove there, parked below the building, took the elevator up to the 5th floor, and knocked on the door. For the past 2 days, Barrett hadn't gone to the Meridian, hadn't called anyone, hadn't seen anyone. He had stayed alone inside the large house, the house Monica had left, walking from room to room, looking at what remained. The wine glass she used to use still sitting in the cabinet, the slippers in the bedroom still beside the bed, the bottle of perfume on the vanity still carrying a little weight. Monica had walked out of the house, but her traces hadn't. and Barrett realized that living among the traces of someone who had betrayed you was heavier than living alone, because every object she left behind reminded him of a question he didn't want to answer. When had he missed it? Tessa opened the door. Jolene was at the home of the neighbor on the 3rd floor. The apartment was quiet. Afternoon sunlight passing through the thin curtains, laying gold across the wooden floor. Tessa looked different from the last time Barrett had seen her, the morning she woke and cried when she saw him pouring milk for Jolene. Her face was still thin, but no longer pale. Her eyes were brighter. Her back was straighter. She had eaten regularly for the past 2 days, thanks to the food Barrett had sent someone to bring every morning. No questions, no explanation. Just one bag of food left outside the door at 7 o'clock, enough for mother and daughter for the whole day. Tessa sat at the kitchen table, with a glass of water in front of her and the small notebook lying half open, the notebook she had once used to write things down at the Meridian. Barrett sat across from her. The two of them sat in the same places where they had sat many times during the past week, but the air was different, lighter, quieter. No urgency left, no plan to discuss, no diagram to draw, no trap to set. Everything was done, and they sat there in the silence that comes afterward, the kind of silence that belongs to people who have just gone through a storm and are sitting there watching the sky clear again. Barrett spoke first. "You saved my life." Tessa shook her head slightly. "I only said what I knew." "No," Barrett said. "A lot of people knew. Staff in the restaurant, managers, guards, drivers. Everyone saw something. Everyone heard something. But no one spoke. You were different." Tessa looked down at the glass of water. Her fingers slowly turned it against the tabletop in a small circle. Barrett looked at her and asked, his voice soft, "Why were you different?" Tessa didn't look up. She gave a faint smile, thin and sad, then said, "You already know why." Barrett nodded. He knew. She had told him on the balcony that night, about the rain, about the mountain road, about the phone call she had never made. He didn't need to hear it again, and she didn't need to tell it again. Some stories only need to be told once. After that, a nod is enough. Barrett placed an envelope on the table, a white envelope, thick, with no name written on it. Tessa looked at it but didn't touch it. "There are 2 things inside," Barrett said. "First, confirmation of a scholarship at the vocational school across the city. You can choose any field you want. The tuition has been fully paid. Second, a long-term lease agreement for this apartment for you and Jolene. 3 years. I signed it." Tessa looked at the envelope. Then she pushed it back toward Barrett. "I didn't do it for money." Barrett didn't push the envelope back. He left it lying in the middle of the table, between them. "I know," he said. "That's why you deserve to accept it. This isn't repayment. I don't repay courage with money, because then I'd be turning what you did into a transaction. This isn't a transaction." He looked at Tessa. "This is me making sure that the person who dared to tell the truth has more choices in life. You've lived too long without any choices. I want to change that." Tessa looked at the envelope, looked at Barrett. Then she slowly pulled the envelope back and placed it in front of herself. She didn't open it, only set it there, as if she needed more time to get used to the idea that someone could give her something without asking for anything back. Silence settled for a while. Then Tessa asked, her voice gentle, her eyes straight on Barrett. "Mr. Caldwell, will you live differently after all of this?" Barrett leaned back in his chair. The question caught him off guard. Not because it was difficult, but because it had been a very long time since anyone had asked him a question that truly cared about him. Not the kind of caring that came from fear, or need, or wanting something from him. The kind of caring that asked because it wanted to know. "I don't know what living differently looks like," Barrett said, his voice slow, not the voice of a boss, and not the voice of the boy who lost his mother that he had used on the balcony that night. It was a voice somewhere in between, the voice of a 32-year-old man trying to be honest with himself, maybe for the first time. "I've lived this way since I was 16. Build, control, protect. Don't let anyone get too close. I don't know any other way." He stopped, then said, "But I know I don't want to wake up in an empty house every morning and wonder why no one stayed. I've been waking up like that for the past 2 days, and I know I don't want to live the rest of my life that way." Tessa looked at Barrett, looked at the man the whole city feared, sitting at the small kitchen table in her apartment, saying that he was afraid of waking up alone. And she realized that loneliness didn't distinguish between rich and poor. It came for anyone who built walls too high and forgot to open the door. Then start there, Tessa said. Start by asking why. Why no one stayed. Why the house is empty. Why you're sitting here talking to a waitress instead of someone else. She stopped. The answer might not be easy to hear, but at least you're asking. And asking is the first step. Barrett looked at Tessa. He didn't nod, didn't say, "You're right," but he listened. And Tessa knew he listened because his eyes changed, just slightly. Not enough for other people to notice, but Tessa noticed because she was used to reading everything through someone's eyes. Barrett stood. He adjusted the sleeve of his suit, the habit he had whenever a conversation was ending. But this time, he stopped at the door, his hand on the handle, and spoke without turning around. "Tessa." "Yes? Thank you. Not because you told me about Donovan, but because you're the first person in many years who's spoken to me without needing anything from me." Tessa didn't answer. She sat at the kitchen table, the white envelope in front of her, the glass of water gone cold, and listened to Barrett's footsteps moving down the hallway, the elevator opening and closing, the silence returning. Then she looked down at the envelope. She placed her hand on it, felt the thickness of the papers inside. A scholarship, a 3-year lease, things she hadn't dared dream of 1 week earlier. She didn't open the envelope right away. She only sat there, her hand resting on it, and for the first time in a very long time, Tessa Morrow felt that the future wasn't something she had to fear. 3 months later, the Meridian still opened every evening. The lights still glowed warmly through the large glass windows at the front. Guests still made reservations, still ate, still drank, still left with satisfied smiles. From the outside, the restaurant hadn't changed, but inside, everything was different. Barrett Caldwell sold off parts of his other businesses, shrinking the empire he had spent more than 10 years building. He didn't explain to anyone why. He simply signed the papers, transferred ownership, closed one door after another, and focused on the Meridian as a real restaurant, legal and clean. Frank Weber handled the legal side. Wade remained beside Barrett, but his work was much lighter now, with no more midnight calls, no more trips no one was allowed to ask about. Barrett no longer sat at the dark corner table every night. He went home before 9 o'clock. The house was still large, still quiet, but Barrett began to live inside it more instead of only sleeping there overnight before leaving again. Donovan Hale was prosecuted on charges of conspiracy to kidnap, insurance fraud, and embezzlement. The hired driver confessed the entire plan in exchange for a reduced sentence. The camera footage from Barrett's backup hard drive became key evidence. The footage Donovan had thought he had erased completely, without knowing that Barrett always kept a copy. Monica faced the court with her own lawyer, but the evidence was too clear. The camera photos, the flow of money, the testimony, everything pointed in one direction. Barrett attended the first hearing. He sat in the last row, watching Donovan in the defendant's seat, watching Monica seated on the other side of the courtroom. The two people he had once trusted most in the world were now sitting there under the neon lights of the courthouse, and Barrett realized he didn't need to see anymore. He stood after 10 minutes, walked out of the courtroom, and didn't return. Some endings don't need to be watched all the way through. One weekend morning, in the 5th-floor apartment on the east side of the city, Tessa Morrow and Jolene sat eating breakfast. Sunlight shone through the window, spilling gold over the small kitchen table, over the bowl of cereal, over the drawing notebook lying open beside the plate of fruit. Jolene was eating and drawing at the same time, a green crayon in her right hand, a spoonful of cereal in her left, moving back and forth between eating and coloring without seeing any conflict between the two. Tessa sat across from her, both hands around a cup of coffee, watching her daughter. Her face had changed, no longer thin and pale, no more dark circles under her eyes from working night shifts. She was going back to school now, at the vocational school across town, taking Jolene to school each morning before going to class, picking her up in the afternoon, and eating dinner with her daughter each evening at this small kitchen table. A simple life, but for the first time in many years, Tessa didn't have to calculate whether there was enough food for both of them at dinner. "Mom," Jolene looked up from her drawing notebook, milk still on her mouth. "Why did Mr. Barrett help us?" Tessa set down her coffee cup, looked at her daughter. Children's questions were always the simplest and the hardest to answer. "Because I did the right thing," Tessa said, even when it was very hard. Jolene thought about that for a moment, with the serious thinking of a 7-year-old, her eyes lifting to the ceiling, then dropping to the notebook. then turning back to her mother. Like Grandma used to say, Jolene said, doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it helps you sleep well. Tessa smiled. A wide, warm smile, the kind she hadn't been able to smile in a very long time. She pulled Jolene into her arms, held her, rested her chin on the top of her daughter's head, and closed her eyes. Jolene still had the crayon in her hand, still trying to draw while being hugged by her mother, and complained softly that Mom was making her line crooked. Tessa laughed quietly and didn't let go. That same morning, Barrett Caldwell stood on the second-floor balcony of the Meridian, a cup of coffee in his hand. The city spread out below, the streets beginning to brighten, cars beginning to move, pedestrians beginning to appear on the sidewalks. Dawn. The sky shifted from purple to pink to gold, slowly, patiently, as though the sky was never in a hurry. Barrett took a sip of coffee and watched the light spread across the rooftops. There were no calls he needed to answer, no plans he needed to handle, no one standing behind him waiting for orders. Only him, the cup of coffee, and the morning. Barrett looked down at the rear parking lot behind the restaurant. The black car was still parked in the same place, with the real license plate, exactly where it belonged. He looked at the car and remembered that Saturday morning a few months earlier, when a little girl had tugged on his sleeve and opened a crayon notebook. He remembered the crooked drawing, remembered the uneven handwriting, remembered the round eyes looking up at him without a trace of fear, and he remembered that that moment had changed everything. It wasn't money that saved him. It wasn't power. It wasn't the system he had built. It was a night shift waitress who dared to tell the truth when everyone else chose silence, and a 7-year-old girl drawing with crayons, because to children, telling the truth is the most ordinary thing in the world. Only adults make it difficult. Barrett finished the coffee, set the cup down on the railing, looked at the city once more, and he realized something that more than 10 years of building an empire had never taught him, but a few weeks of collapse had. Success wasn't a big house where no one wanted to stay. It wasn't power that made everyone afraid, but made no one love you. It wasn't a bank account with many digits, while the person closest to you wanted to turn you into nothing. Success was being alive to stand on a balcony on an ordinary morning, drink an ordinary cup of coffee, and know that you hadn't become the man the people who betrayed you believed you were. Success was looking back and knowing that when faced with a choice between revenge and doing what was right, you had chosen what was right. Even when it was hard, even when it hurt, even when you had to swallow the greatest anger of your life. This story reminds us that the most dangerous enemy is not the person standing across from you, but the person standing right behind you, smiling every day and waiting. But this story also reminds us that courage doesn't need power, doesn't need money, doesn't need weapons. Courage only needs one person willing to speak when everyone around them chooses to close their eyes. And sometimes, the person who saves your life isn't the strongest, the richest, or the most powerful. It is the person who has nothing but the truth, and the courage to speak that truth aloud. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button and share it with the people you care about. We would love to know how you feel after hearing this story, so please leave a comment below so we can hear the feelings from deep inside your heart. Every line of your comment is a great source of encouragement for us to continue bringing meaningful stories every day. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next compelling videos. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.